Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Striation 6 podcast. I am your host, Sam Trotta. I am the owner of Striation 6. And as it is with everything I do my best to do in the exercise industry, it is my intention to bring you this podcast with the aim of helping as many of you out there as possible feel, function, look, and live better through exercise. And this episode marks part three of what I'm calling the exercise versus series. And this week we're talking about exercise versus practice and training. And before I get going with what we did last week, I just wanted to put a couple of notes out there on the point of this series. And I don't mean to beat a dead horse. I've spoken about this in parts one and two, but I do want to restate that when I'm comparing exercise to other kinds of physical effort, in this episode, like I said, it'll be practice and training. Last week, we were talking about play and activity versus exercise. I want to make sure that all of you out there know I'm not trying to cast exercise as better than any of these things. In fact, I think exercise and all of these other types of physical effort that I'm outlining are in varying degrees essential and potentially healthy and potentially healthy in a holistic sense, not necessarily for your body, but healthy in a holistic sense. And that at the end of the day, when we're looking to aim our exercise at something, it's usually one of these other things. Not many people are exercising for exercise's sake. There's usually some sort of external goal attached to the exercise. So this is not a matter of better or worse. It's just a question of distinguishing exercise. And honestly, that just requires some thought and care. And this series is intended to sort of foster some of the thought and care that I believe is necessary to distinguish exercise from these other types of physical effort. If you're not in a place, if you listening are not in a place to extend such thinking or care, this may not be the series for you. And that's okay. That's cool. There's tons of other exercise and fitness podcasts out there. But if even one person out there changes his or her approach to exercise for the better as a result of listening to this podcast series, then this whole effort will have absolutely been worth it. I also want to reiterate that I'm open to disagreement or other forms of helpful engagement. So please feel free to leave comments on this episode if you're watching on YouTube or on Spotify, or you can just email me directly. This is my direct email. No one answers my emails for me. This is all me at this point. I'm not that big of a deal yet. So this is all me answering my own email. It's just sam@striation6.com. That's STRIATION and then the number 6.com. And I'd love to engage with you. So just as a brief recap of last week, we talked about exercise versus activity and play. And when we're talking about activity and play, we were talking about generally sort of low, undefined levels of physical effort that were really more about engaging with other people or just acquiring some marginal degree of physical effort to gain other sorts of health benefits, like benefits of being outside, having fun with others, getting some laughs in, a lot of mental and psychological health benefits available with play or with activity. The challenge with them that we faced was when we're looking to accumulate the benefits of exercise, that there were problems with the amount of resistance applied in activity and play, in that they were insufficient to potentially cause the physical adaptations that we might look to accumulate through exercise. They were also kind of undefined and inconsistent. So that was an issue too. And then in certain cases where you think you might be playing, you may have a joint or a certain area of your body that just can't handle what the play entails. So it could go from being really light and insufficient in a lot of ways to kind of uh, overly sufficient, if that's even a thing. It could be overly sufficient depending on what area of the body you're looking at. That last concern is a minor one when we're looking at activity and play, and it might come into play, haha, so to speak, here when we talk about practice and training. So it's, when we're getting into exercise versus practice and training, these are types of physical effort where the three of them, practice, training, exercise, they often get conflated as all kind of one and the same thing. And there is a lot of overlap. In the final part of this series, I'll be talking about the overlap between these various kinds of physical effort. They're not mutually exclusive from one another. There's a lot of overlap between them. But I think if any episode is going to stir controversy, it's funny. I was just talking with a colleague of mine here at Striation 6, and we were talking about people that criticize podcasters, and particularly podcasters in the science and exercise spaces, and you get sort of really nitpicky with them. And I figured if, at some point somebody gets super nitpicky, critical, and petty with me, it means I'm becoming successful as a podcaster. So, don't do me any favors, but at the same time, I'm looking forward to all the comments that may come of this. And if there is going to be some kind of controversy about the distinctions between exercise and other kinds of physical effort, it's probably going to be here. I'm guessing it's going to be here next week. We've got exercise versus labor and competition, or I'll say competition and labor. And then we'll do just kind of a final recap of the series and some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about exercise versus other kinds of physical effort going forward. So, what I thought I would do here is just reiterate my view of exercise. And again, this isn't me trying to sound smart. This is a really detailed and kind of distinct view of exercise that I've developed over more than 2 decades as an exercise professional at various levels of hopefully increasing, but various levels of competency. In my view, exercise is a deliberate, voluntary, and primarily physical effort on the part of an individual with a particular intention to cause or prevent a specific movement or series of movements in a specific manner or orchestration in the body of that individual against an also specifically applied resistance in a sufficient amount with the aim of improving a given number of internal bodily functions and therein producing better health in the individual, including but not limited to muscular output, muscle growth, active available joint mobility, movement orchestration under certain conditions, and cardiorespiratory function that is divorced to the greatest extent possible from the performance of outcomes, tasks, and events that would or could occur outside of the body of the individual. And in part one of this series, you can feel free to refer back to it. I go into each part of that definition in a bit more detail just to sort of set the standard against which other forms of physical effort will be, it's not measured. Measured is definitely the wrong word. Will be compared and contrasted. Let's say that was my favorite kind of essay to write in high school. So compare and contrast. Anyway, dork alert. So let's move into the types of physical effort that we're focusing on today. We're talking about exercise versus practice and training. All right. And you often won't hear people going to the gym talking about going to practice, though for some people it kind of applies, powerlifters, Olympic lifters. You will hear people talk about going to the gym, a place of exercise, for training, which could also be a legitimate thing. You could also hear people refer to practice and training interchangeably. And to me, these things are all distinct. I've distinguished exercise in my view already. In my view, practice, as it is commonly used in the physical sense, okay, in terms of, yeah, the physical performance of some kind of physical practice. Practice is the mindful acquisition and or rehearsal of a skilled movement or particular set of skilled movements, potentially in a particular sequence that is wholly tied to the performance of events that take place outside of the physical body of the participant, with the sole intention of having the participant improve in his or her performance of the skilled movement or movements involved as they relate to the external outcome desired. Okay, now that's a mouthful. So I've got some examples here. All right. So some examples might include, and feel free to disagree with me on this. I love disagreement. When someone disagrees with me and they're right, I learned something. I get better. So your disagreement, potentially at least, makes me better. So please feel free. So some examples of practice might include repeating a specific component of dance choreography, free throw practice in basketball, just standing at the free throw line. There's a tongue twister, and trying to get that ball in the net harder than it looks. Learning or relearning to walk. Learning, I had to include a jujitsu thing in here. Learning an offensive or defensive sequence in jujitsu with little or no meaningful resistance from your training partner. And if you've ever been to a jujitsu class, this is actually what we spend the bulk of time doing, at least in most of the jujitsu classes that I've been to under, at this point, a decent variety of different instructors. A final example of practice that I'm giving here is practicing an Olympic lift technique or a particular aspect of an Olympic lift technique. They're very complicated movements. People who think they can just go to some warehouse somewhere and start throwing barbells over their head and calling it Olympic lifts, you got another thing coming. These are very complicated movements. So practicing an Olympic lift technique or a particular aspect of an Olympic lift technique with a load that is 5 to 30% tops of your maximum. All right. So we're talking low levels of resistance. We're talking relatively low levels of complexity. We're talking low levels of opposition with the intention of just getting better at the skill or set of skills or set of skills in sequence. All right. When we go into training, there's a lot of overlap between practice and training. The difference really comes down to how hard it is uh, and how hard the conditions make the execution of the thing you're trying to do. I got tongue twisted there. How hard the conditions make it for you to actually do the thing that you're trying to do. Pardon my tongue twist there. So, in my view, training is the deliberate attempt to apply a previously practiced set of physical skills or sequences aimed at the performance that take place, aimed at the performance of events that take place outside of the human body in a scenario that seeks to mimic competition, live performance, and the general application of acquired skill sets outside of the learning setting in multivariate ways and degrees, such as adding varying amounts of resistance, time, or opposition from another participant. In other words, use the thing that you're practicing in a quote unquote real or approaching real setting. So when we're practicing, we're kind of acquiring, getting the skills under our skin. All right. When we're training, we're making it harder to actually execute on those skills. And then in competition, this is where we're live. And that's something we'll talk about next week. So some examples of training that I've given here, and I've deliberately taken the examples from practice and put a training sort of bent to them here. Performing a large section or whole set of dance choreography, rehearsing plays in basketball. So we're not just taking a shot, we're looking at whole sequences here. Going for a walk for a specific, relatively extensive period of time. All right. So I have a 2-year-old son. He's super cute. That's my bias talking there, but most people agree. And he learned to walk. He started learning to walk about a year ago. He was just under 1 when he started learning to walk. And he's been, just sort of walking more now. He plays outside. The other day, yesterday, actually, my wife told me that he walked most of the way home from from his daycare. Now that it's about a kilometer, I would say, from our house to daycare. So he probably walked something like 750 meters. For Americans that might be listening, that's about half a mile. And he's 2, and he might not have known it, but he was training. He was training that walking skill set there. And based on his personality type, when he was done, he started yelling, and my wife said she stopped, and he just basically started climbing into his stroller. Like, he was done. He tapped out. We'll talk about that idea in a little bit as well. So that's walking, and my diversion into my real life example of training walking here. Another example of training could be attempting a particularly offensive or defensive sequence in jiu-jitsu where your training partner is giving you meaningful resistance against your intended sequence. So in practice, your training partner isn't dead fishing it. I hate it when people do that. Just like, be alive, please, for the love of God. But they're not dead fishing it, but they're giving you very, very low level of resistance. They're just giving you basically a live body to work with, versus in training, drilling or other forms of the undertaking of jiu-jitsu that involves more than kind of light practice of a sequence, but less than full-on sparring. This is what I would consider training. Okay. A lot of people would just call it drilling. And then lastly, when we're looking at Olympic lifts, practicing an Olympic lift or implementing a particularly nuanced Olympic lifting technique under greater than 30% of your maximum load in that lift. Now, a lot of people might listen to this and say, but 30% doesn't sound like a lot. Again, try training Olympic lifting, and you will find most people work with relatively low, excuse me, relatively low percentages of their maximum for extensive amounts of reps, or as extensive of an amount of reps as they can tolerate, with the idea being that technique is as important in this whole thing as just general output. Okay. So that's practice and training. Now, when we compare practice and training with exercise, when we're looking at practice and training in this view, the main focus in both is both, again, on external events, wherein given the view we're using of exercise, exercise focuses on internal events. Now, here's the thing. Again, I'm not saying one's better than the other. In fact, these things are essentially interlinked. It's important to note that exercise relates very directly to practice and training, in that certain physical skill sets that one might want to acquire, practice, and then train require certain minimum amounts of physical health output and internal capabilities. These are what, at these last things, these physical health output, internal capabilities, the things that we brought up in the view of exercise, these are what exercise seek to improve. All right. So exercise can therefore be leveraged to help acquire, practice, and train certain physical skill sets. So although exercise differs from practice and training, it is closely related to them. Don't conflate them. Don't conflate them. And when it comes to, this is probably going to get me in trouble with exercise people. I don't know. Sure, get me in trouble. There, you may need less exercise than you think, depending on what you're trying to acquire, practice, and train from an external performance physical skill set. All right. That external performance term is something I learned in my education in the resistance training specialist program. And it's the distinction between internal performance and external performance pointed out in the RTS thought process is something that really kind of blew my mind wide open about how to think about what we're doing when we're exerting physical effort. And it's kind of, in a sense, the basis of this whole series that I'm talking about. And to that end, when we're talking about internal performance versus external performance, when we're talking about practice and training and acquiring these skill sets that allow us to perform things outside of our body, health is not necessarily considered in practice and training. Whereas in exercise, in my view, it's a primary consideration. Once we're not working to get healthier, we're not exercising anymore. I'll say it again. Once the effort is no longer moving toward greater levels of health, we're not exercising anymore. We're training or practicing or doing something else other than exercise because we're no longer working towards greater health. There's a threshold that gets crossed, and it's invisible, and there's no clear line, and that's why we have to be careful when we're looking to produce health in people, and we're looking to produce health in ourselves. All right, there's this invisible line that can mistakenly get crossed, and now all of a sudden, we left health behind. And it happens to the best of us. As I sit here with a very sore ankle right now, unintendedly, what are you going to do? It happens sometimes. We do our best to get back up, with me literally, and we get going again. But when when the drive towards external outcomes comes at the cost of health, we really have to be careful that what we're doing is not at cross purposes with what we started out wanting to do. So there will be people who undertake exercise, for example, and this is a very sort of stereotypical or prototypical point of view. There will be people who, or example, not point of view, example, there will be people who undertake physical effort because they consider themselves overweight and unhealthy and low energy, and they don't like how they look. They don't like they don't like how they function. They don't like how they feel. And they start doing some kind of physical effort, in just some kind of physical effort. And based on the fact that they are performing some kind of physical effort, they're seeing adaptations that seem like they're healthy at the start. And because they seem like they're healthy and they're producing good things, weight is falling off in combination with, let's say, better nutrition and an overall effort that's conducive to a health producing result. At first, they keep going and going and going with it. And then somewhere along the way, there's a line that's crossed based on the level of effort put out. And there's a shoulder that's sore, and there's a knee that's sore, and there's a back that's sore. Maybe there's a full on injury versus just a soreness. And people might be out there saying, well, yeah, but that's still better than a whole lifestyle that's just sore and sad and making the person sort of not wanting to participate in things and not liking how they feel, not liking the way they look, the way they live. And I'm sitting here going, guy, to an extent, I can agree with you. However, now what does the person do? They figured out this one way of going kind of hard at it. Maybe they under practiced, maybe they under exercised, and now they've overly trained because that going hard seemed so tempting because it sort of felt exhilarating and it felt super effortful and it made weight fly in their view. It made weight fly off faster. And now they're injured. And what's that regression going to look like? And what's that regression going to look like psychologically? Small, progressive, process oriented, steady changes over the long term are what we want to see for the best outcomes. Period. The end. If you've got a particular athletic bent or performance bent, that's another discussion. But when we're talking about health production and people who are concerned about their long term health, slow and steady, it doesn't win the race. It is the race. It doesn't win the race. It is the race that you're in, if that's the race you want to actually be in. Now, in my opinion, a good practice or training leader, whether it's an external leader, whether it's external as in it's someone else, or it's you leading yourself, will take your own health or the the participants in the group health into consideration for long-term gain. Unfortunately, that's not what always happens in the fitness industry. And maybe that's just a circumstance of, a group setting, or, this is what we showed up for. If we showed up to go hard, no one said it was healthy. We just said it was going to be awesome. No one said jujitsu is healthy for your joints, right? Ask anybody who's been doing it for a while, but that's not going to stop anyone who does it from wanting to continue doing it unless they get absolutely crippled. And that crippling, whether it's literal or metaphorical, is exactly what I would love for you to avoid, in part, at least, by taking this view on exercise versus all these other kinds of physical effort into consideration so that you can direct yourself into the right kind of physical effort for your goals. Maybe you need to exercise more and train less for a while. Maybe you need to practice more and train less and exercise less for a little while. Maybe you just need to exercise and save the practice or training for a time when your exercise has brought you to a point where your overall physical health and capability lends itself to the kind of practice and then training that you want to undertake. Now, this could all be taken as a little esoteric. At the same time, if you give it a bit of consideration, I think you might find that you see some benefit. So that's all for today. That's exercise versus practice and training. Next time, we'll be doing competition and then labor, and just sneak preview on that. Those two things don't relate to each other in my mind. I just didn't want to make it like a 7-episode series. So we're going to do competition and labor next time, and then just a recap of the series. I hope this has been helpful. If I'm a pedantic esoteric dude, then tell me I'm a pedantic esoteric dude. At the same time, if like I said, if this has helped one person exercise better and be healthier for the long term so they can do the things they love with the people that they cherish the most, my job is done. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I will speak to you, see you. Enjoy. See you next time.